All right, we're going to dive just a bit deeper into the climbing with open hips discussion because we work with all sorts of climbers and we all have prejudices about what might be better or better for us or best for us given our hip flexibility. However, when we decide that we don't climb with open hips a ton because we have poor hip flexibility, oftentimes we're cutting ourselves out of moves that we do actually have the hip flexibility for. And then we also just in that create this snowball effect of this huge skill gap of just knowing what doing a move with open hips looks like. And as we get into harder and harder climbs, this is Turkish Airways 13C, that hip positioning becomes an incredibly, absolutely vital, really, tool to solving these kind of red point cruxes in a way that works for you. And often we'll switch back and forth between closed hip and open hip movements several times within a sequence. So to have this skill gap and only be climbing things with closed hip, whether that's turned hips or drop knee, and not being willing to try the open hip positions because we've already decided those don't work for us, it creates a huge roadblock for people in their progression as climbers. And so while you may have limited hip flexibility for the time being, that is a changeable quality about yourself. And even with the hip flexibility that you do have, there are moves that you can do with open hips, depending on the grade, depending on the steepness of the terrain, and where those hips might be. And so I obviously feel very strongly about this. We need to practice both within the range that we have so that we have both tools. So when we are trying to solve a problem, a beta crux is a problem that we're solving, we're not leaving one tool on the table and just not even looking at it at all. So as I make this first move with an open hip, then I close my hips to come over, and I make this next move with closed hips, and this next move I keep that drop knee. But before I even go to make the following move, I turn my whole situation around and I open that right hip for this move here. And I think what I wanted to point out here is that's not a lot of hip flexibility right there. That's a cognition around that position would be better and I want to try it. So because I've climbed both ways for a long time and I consistently practice both, I'm more attuned to the fact that I should open my hip just for that move. And then I come in here and I go for the side pull with still open hip. And I even set up for this next move really intentionally with an open hip position. So it's really important to just be open-minded to practicing both, even if you have a slight limitation on your hip mobility. We want to make sure that we're always willing to look at both options so we don't cut our progress off at our feet. Further on this is we do have then specific drills where we practice these things in an environment that makes it really easy to compare and contrast the differences and see where your limitations are. So in some of our drill design, we have people doing same moves, some with open hip, like I'm showing here, and then we have them go through and do the same thing with a drop knee configuration. This allows people the chance to really practice both and to compare and contrast them directly. The interesting thing about this, though, is the drop knee configuration does eventually stop your hip trajectory, and sometimes the furthest lateral moves are not accessible out of that position, whereas when I do it with an open hip, I can. And so just maintaining the ability to stay open to these different lower body positions is intensely important for progression, especially as you get into harder and harder climbs. These are often the slight subtleties that make a difference between I sent that route, I could do that crux, and that route is not for me. So if you've ever found yourself being like, I can never try an open hip move, I would, from my heart, ask that you open yourself up to that process because there's probably a few more moves to do than you think you can, and your hip flexibility is a movable, changeable quality about yourself.